Why, hello everybody, it's Histor-Tea Time! Hello everybody. Forgive me, I was having water instead of my usual. So today we're going to kind of do a small segment on the Cold War, specifically affecting Asia. Not a lot of people think about it. A lot of people definitely view the Soviet Union as the bad guy, and most movies that were Cold War era movies, spy movies, anything, it's always like CIA versus KGB, and it's always like the bad guys are always Russian. So I think that this is kind of cool because it gives you, you know, the idea of what we're trying to contain, and it shows you, one, why China is the way it is now, right? So I think it's important that you guys learn about the Cold War in Asia. Woo! Okay, so just to recap everything. The Cold War was a conflict between the rival ideologies of the USA and the Soviet Union, and it lasted from 1945 to 1991. Now, early on in the Cold War, from 45 to 49, the focus was of the conflict in Europe. Now, the United States used the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, and NATO to successfully contain communism in Europe. But beginning in 1949, however, containment seemed to fail as communism spread to China, Korea, and Vietnam, all in Asia. For almost 2,000 years, China was the world's most dominant empire because of trade along the Silk Road and the power of the ruling dynasties. And I'm talking way back into like BC era, okay? We got them ruling forever. In the 16 and 1700s, travel back in time with me now. European nations became powerful, began exploring, and claiming colonies. If you were in my class for the Age of Exploration, you had such a fun time because we talked about all the explorers and pirates and how they impacted the Age of Exploration. It was super, super cool. Then we went into the Industrial Revolution in the 1700s and 1800s, and that made Europe the center of power in the world. Europeans used imperialism to control Africa and Asia. Britain used the Opium Wars to claim trade rights in China. The Opium Wars, I wish I had talked about that more. I might a little later. I think it'd be kind of interesting to do a little segment on that. By 1900, China was weak and divided into little spheres of influence. Oh no. A group of reformers called nationalists called for changes. In 1912, Sun Yat-sen ended the Chinese dynastic system and created a democracy called the Republic of China. But the Republic did not modernize China and led to an era of chaos. In the 1920s, nationalist leader Chiang Kai-shek, I hope I said that right, took over and ran China as a dictatorship. Meanwhile, communism was growing in China under the leadership of Mao Zedong. Oh no. Mao's Communist Party gained popularity among poor peasants by offering to redistribute land from wealthy warlords. Now, Mao was born into a peasant family. He embraced Marxist socialism, and if you don't know what that is, that's all about Karl Marx and his radical form of socialism, as a young man. Though he began as an urban labor organizer, he quickly realized the revolutionary potential of China's peasants. So in 1927, he predicted that the force of peasantry is like that of raging winds and driving rain. So epic. They will bury beneath them all forces of imperialism, militarism, and corrupt officialdom, village bosses, and evil gentry. Interesting. Mao's first attempt to lead the peasants in revolt failed in 1927, but during the Japanese occupation, Mao and his followers won widespread peasant support by reducing rents and promising to redistribute land. That's important. Remember, just remember what he's doing. It's important. So from 1930 to 1949, nationalists and communists fought in a very bloody civil war for control of China. So for the nationalists, we had Jiang Jieshi. I really hope I'm saying these names right. And then in the communists, we had Mao Zedong. So this was southern versus northern China, essentially. Now, when World War II began, Chiang and Mao agreed to a truce from 1937 to 1945. However, after World War II, communists gained support and began to win control of China. And in 1949, the communists won the Civil War and Mao created the People's Republic of China. So whenever you see PRC, that's what that is. The three revolutionary communists at this time were Karl Marx, Vladimir Lenin, and Mao Zedong. So these are the people that kind of, in this sphere of the world, were the icons of revolutionary communism. Almost spilled all my water. Okay. Chiang's government fled China and set up in Taiwan. So that's where we get Taiwan. No, not really. No. Okay, Chiang's government fled China and set up in Taiwan. The USA was shocked when China fell to communism and only recognized the nationalists as the government of China. Now, based upon this propaganda poster, what changes will Mao propose for China? Can you tell me in the comments below? Mao was determined to reshape China's economy based on Marxist socialism. He seized land from the rich and divided the land among the poor peasants. He followed Stalin's example by creating collective farms and a 5-year plan to improve Chinese industry. Now, based upon this propaganda poster, what 2 things will Mao's Great Leap Forward focus on? I'll tell you. He began a massive program in 1958 to create agriculture and industry called the Great Leap Forward. Millions of Chinese citizens were sent to work on large collective farms to grow food. These were commune ideas, and other citizens were required to work on massive industrial projects like making iron and steel or building dams and railroads. The idea that Mao was enforcing was struggle hard for 3 years, change the face of China, catch up with Britain and America. Yeah. Mao's Great Leap Forward started well, but it required forced labor and led to lots of suffering by millions of Chinese citizens. The Great Leap Forward was a failure and actually led to severe food shortages, famine, and poor quality industry. Mao ended the Great Leap Forward just after 3 years. These are some Chinese peasants. Look at that, they're starving, they're begging, it's terrible. Now, what do you think is the purpose of Mao's Cultural Revolution based upon this image? I'll tell you. Now, after the failure of the Great Leap, he began the Cultural Revolution, which was from 1966 to 1976. It's 10 years. The goal of the Cultural Revolution was to emphasize Mao's strict socialist ideas and attack traditional Chinese ideas. He distributed to all the Chinese citizens the Little Red Book. So it's a book of his quotes that reinforced what was acceptable for Chinese communists. It's like his own little Bible almost. Ridiculous. He targeted young people, and many joined the Red Guards, a group of people that protected the culture of the revolution. As you can see, he is almost blatantly copying the Soviet Union because their army was the Red Army. Now, Red Guards closed schools and universities. They burned books and humiliated, beat, and killed people who opposed Mao's ideas. This is bad. This looks very similar to pretty much Hitler and the Nazi propaganda movement. Oh my god. This is the book burning. This is literally anybody who opposed him. They were beating him, torturing him, killing him. They're humiliating and torturing people. The Cultural Revolution unified the Chinese people, but also led to the deaths or imprisonment of thousands of citizens. He executed teachers, politicians, and anyone who criticized his ideas. So, this is bad. This is an execution about to happen. In 1976, Mao Zedong died and was followed by more moderate communist officials. Even without Mao, China remains a communist nation to this day. So, well, I'll give you some quotes here. Remember that big movement for making iron and steel? We made a lot of steel. That was when we cut down all the trees on the hills. As for the steel we made, well, of course there was no use for it. Later on, the family sent me a message. They were all well nigh starved to death. That was during the famine. So I forgot about the steel making and got home as fast as I could to feed all those mouths. The first people who starved to death in those days were buried in thin coffins. Then bodies were put in a couple of vats joined rim to rim. Later on, when everyone was so weak with hunger they couldn't move, whole families died and were just left where they lay. This is the Great Leap Forward. This is from the supposed where everything was going to get better. Yeah, nothing got better. At meetings, the Red Guards used the quotations of Chairman Mao no matter what was being discussed. Rewards given to all levels were copies of the quotations or Mao badges, and they were handed out year after year. Chairman Mao's portraits and statues were everywhere, as well as a basket full of quotations in every household, whether people could read or not. We made Chairman Mao into a god. But how could he be aware of the minutest details of everything he is set, or everything as set in his room in Beijing? This was the Cultural Revolution. And moving on. No. Here we go. Okay, the fall of China to communism had a major impact on the Cold War between the USA and the USSR. The U.S. response to the fall of China was to more aggressively confront communism in the world. The USA was afraid of a domino theory, which I talked about in the other video, in which communist nations would turn their neighbors to communism. As a result, the USA vowed to contain the spread of communism through anywhere in the world. The USA acted when communism threatened Korea. During World War II, Korea was liberated from Japanese control by the U.S. Army in the south and Soviet Army in the north. After World War II, Korea was divided along the 38th parallel, with a communist government in the north and then a democratic government in South Korea. In 1950, North Korea, using Soviet-supplied weapons, crossed the 38th parallel and attacked South Korea. When South Korea appealed to the United Nations, the USA sent troops to Korea to contain the communism. But when the USA pushed too close to China, the Chinese army entered the war and helped North Korea. After 3 years of fighting, a ceasefire was agreed to in 1953. The fighting stopped and the 38th was restored as the boundary between North and South Koreas. The USA successfully stopped communism from spreading into South Korea and showed that it was willing to fight to contain communism. Today, Korea remains divided between Communist North and Democratic South. So, it's a very, very, very brief overview of the Korean War. The fighting in Korea convinced many nations to not choose a side during the Cold War. These neutral countries during the Cold War were known as the non-aligned nations. While Korea was a success, the Cold War would escalate in the 50s and 60s as communism threatened Asia, Southeast Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Alrighty, so that will pick up with the other video, and that'll lead into the end of the Cold War. So I hope that you've enjoyed this segment of Histor-Tea Time with me, your favorite historian. I know that the Cold War kind of is... I know that the Cold War is kind of confusing, and it spans for quite a few decades, so it's a lot of history to cover, and I had to break it down in a really, really, condensed format. Thankfully, this was done by Mrs. Kent, who is an amazing world history teacher that I work with, and this was her PowerPoint, but I kind of moved everything around and kind of edited some things. So I hope that you guys really liked it, and I hope you enjoy the next and final installment, which is the end of the Cold War. So, alrighty, thank you again for joining me in another segment of Histor-Tea Time.